The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents The Good Book and the Worth of Women. I recently released a video on what the Bible has to say about rape. And I don't recall if I actually mentioned in the video, but the intent here is to do a series of women and the Bible. We'll cover some specific stories about specific women, but I also want to just deal with women's issues specifically as the Bible treats it, because I think it's a big deal, and I think most people hopefully will recognize how much of a problem this is. Now, I called this video The Good Book and the Worth of Women, in part because everything I'm going to talk about today, or perhaps almost everything, comes directly out of the Torah, which is the Jewish Bible and the first 5 books of the Christian Old Testament. And the thing about this that I find kind of intriguing is I almost had to call this The Good Book and the Worth of Women, Part 1 of 75. Because as I was going through and I was reviewing a number of different sources and checking verses, I would find a problem, note it, then there's a specific story related to that problem. The stories became more and more interesting, and then it became clear that we needed to parse this up. So the first video is on what the Bible has to say or implies about the worth of women in general. And in future videos, we'll take a look at what the Bible has to say about other topics related to women, equality, family, sex, blah, blah, blah. But also, there are some incredibly interesting stories that really give a point to how the Bible talks about women. So let's take a look at the worth of women. I think the first thing to note is just how few women are mentioned in the Bible in any great detail. A great many of them are unnamed. The women, the woman, the girl, etc. Women, by and large, tend to get named in the Bible if they are the wife or daughter of someone and they have some relevance to the story. Wives and daughters, just aren't mentioned, and their stories, by and large, aren't mentioned. One of the key things about when a woman becomes mentioned in the Bible is an issue surrounding barrenness. If a woman is unable to have a child, whether this is a direct curse from God or presumably through some natural process, they tend to get named because now they're relevant in the story. Now they are unable to do the thing that they're supposed to do. And this barrenness issue, I can't wait until we get to some of the stories because it's repeated over and over and over. Some of them are named for becoming barren, some because they overcame it. But that barrenness is often as a punishment, but we'll get to a little bit more on that later. And most of these women don't speak. Their words aren't recorded, and very little about their lives or interactions are recorded. So from the standpoint of looking at it as storytelling, they're quite often just props. Now, there are exceptions to this, and we'll get to that later when we start telling specific stories about specific women in the Bible. There's another thing that I want to note, because this is going to get a lot of reactions, particularly from people who are like, oh, you don't have the first clue what the Bible says, and the Bible's very pro-women and all this other stuff. I also want to make sure that I'm fair, and I like to point out that there are atheists and seculars who are making bad arguments. And so I would caution folks to be careful about how they address how language is used in the Bible. Remember that you're probably reading it in English, and that's a translation of a translation of a copy of a translation of a copy in languages that have changed and or died out. And so, for example, in Genesis, when the story of Noah's Ark, the Bible says the male and his female, referring to the animals. Go get me a pair of animals, the male and his female. And I've seen, I think Skeptics Annotated Bible, and which lots of people have commented on. I don't want to fault anybody responsible for it because that's a great resource. But I think I've seen many times people saying that, this is it, the male and his female, that possessive blah, blah, blah. It is not the possessive portion of that is truly a problem. It's very, very likely that this translation where it says the male and his female is simply the most accurate translation of get me a matched pair, not some male and some female, but a pair of two lions. Which, by the way, reminds me, if you look at pictures of Noah's Ark book, you will occasionally find two lions with manes. So that's not a male and his female. What it does say, though, is the fact that it's always male first, female second. This is a trend in the Bible, and it applies to animals as well. Female animals have a different status than male animals, humans included. So one of the examples that kind of ties into this is in Leviticus 1. If you're making a generic offering of an animal to God, it needs to be an unblemished male. If you're making a sin offering to God and you're a king, it needs to be an unblemished male. This is in Leviticus 4. But if you're a commoner, then any female animal will do as a sacrifice. Now, it doesn't expressly say, if we're going to be fair, because I know that the apologists are going to come storming in, it doesn't say that that's inferior. Maybe the commoners are superior to the king. Yes, maybe we're talking about an ancient progressive society where the king was a wonderful, dutiful servant, and the people have the higher status, and therefore female animals have the higher status. You can do that, but you're going to be laughed at, because this is not the trend throughout the Bible. It's not what history shows us about the relative status of leaders and their people. And so if you're the leader and you're making a sin offering, it needs to be an unblemished male. But if you're a commoner, it can be a female. Now, we can address the bizarre kind of absurdity of sacrificing burnt, bloody animals to a god. Why is this god obsessed with, the smell of burning flesh? But male and female animals, human and otherwise, clearly have different statuses in the Bible, and the women are clearly inferior. I've also put up a video in the past about what the Bible has to say about slavery, and not just relying on Exodus 21. There's passages in Leviticus, and I think one in Deuteronomy as well, if I'm recalling correctly. I'm not going to go over everything the Bible has to say about slavery as it affects women, but I will say that if you read Exodus 21, some of the apologetics are like, oh, you have to let slaves go after 7 years. No, that only applies to Jewish slaves, and it only applies to male Jewish slaves. There's no provision for women to ever be released from slavery, or, just to avoid the apologist, servitude. This status difference shows up in many other places as well, but in Exodus 21, it gives provisions for Jewish slaves and non-Jewish slaves, and specifically the Jewish slave provisions apply only to males. There's no reason to think that females were ever let go. As a matter of fact, it expressly uses women as a prop, because if you need to let your Jewish slave go after 7 years, one way to get around that is to give him a wife and kids, and then when his 7 years is up, he comes to you and says, hey, I don't want to leave my wife and kids, in which case he becomes your slave forever, essentially making him co-equal to the women. Now he's stuck. He doesn't get out after 7 years, etc. His 7 years are up. Exodus 21 also talks about marrying your female slaves, and that if she doesn't please you, you have to let her go. And you need to treat her right. But if you ever take another wife, and that prompts a video in the future about multiple wives and polygamy and the Bible's view on the wholesome family. But if you ever take another wife, you still have to take care of that first slave wife. And if you don't, she is to be set free with no money. That's got to be about the best view on divorce for, a bigoted male as you can imagine. Hey, I get to take a slave and make her my wife. Yeah, I got to treat her right, but hey, that's probably just generally smart. If you beat your slaves to death, that's a problem. So you just beat them just enough so they don't die. Or you're really, really nice to them. You just don't let them go and don't give them their freedom and don't treat them as human beings. And so now I've got my slave wife, but hey, I met this other woman and I'm going to marry her. And I really don't want to have to take care of two wives. So I'll just stop taking care of my slave wife, and now she'll be free, and she gets no money, no compensation, no anything. She's just tossed out the door. There you go. Hey, you're free. Bye. Thanks for all the wonderful sex and stuff that you probably didn't enjoy or want. The Bible doesn't seem to take into account what women want, and they are, in many cases, property, even when they are, air quotes, free. They are the property of men on par with livestock. Look at the Ten Commandments. Do not covet thy neighbor's wife or his ass or anything else that he owns. Wow. Now, I know that there are people who are going to say, yes, but the Bible says this about women, and oh, there's so many positive things. Please, put together the positive things that the Bible says about women. Because so far, what we're finding is they're a second-class citizen. They are compared with livestock in as far as value and who owns what. They have different rules when it comes to slavery. They may or may not have any rights when it comes to marriage and property. Property. Yes, let's take a look at that. So there's a number of ways to look at how the Bible views women as property, but also how to view their rights with respect to property. And right before I get into the details on that, I want to talk about something that's potentially confusing. Even the Bible seems to be very confused about it, and you will find different usages of the terms dowry and bride price throughout the world. And I'm going to go with what I see to be as the most standard, common understandings of dowry and bride price. A bride price is essentially what you would pay to buy your wife from her family. A dowry is what that family, the money and property that family gives the bridegroom along with the wife. Now, I have to be cautious because the Bible uses the word dowry in the English, the King James, etc. And it seems that sometimes it might actually mean bride price. It's not clear that there's an express endorsement of dowry as the sense of the family has to give property and money. But that cost for a dowry, and the reason I'm addressing this is because this was practiced in societies that used the Bible as their moral guide for a very long time. And there's certainly dispute about it. But if you have a dowry, that means that as the father of daughters, I'm going to be giving up property and money to the men who take care of my daughters so that I don't have to. We need to get them married off. And that means that daughters are a net negative. At least a bride price, what the bridegroom would pay to the family in order to buy a bride, puts some positive value on women. It's still a bizarre and immoral process that turns women into a commodity, but at least now they're a positive commodity, whereas in a dowry situation, it essentially makes daughters a net negative because they are going to cost you. If you have sons, they work for you and they can inherit your property. Daughters generally cannot inherit, but there are exceptions. And those sons may not only inherit your stuff, but they may be getting property and money as a dowry from whoever they end up marrying. They may also have to pay a bride's price. It could be a one or the other or both. But by and large, the Bible doesn't offer support for the dowry model of the bride's family paying. But it does have many examples of the bridegroom paying and working to earn the bride. We'll talk more about Jacob's story a little later. Not in this video. But it also talks about gifts that the bride's family gives the bride. And by and large, that gift seems likely to be a handmaid. Essentially, the dowry, to the extent that there is any, that goes along with the bride is, hey, you get to take this slave woman with you to be your handmaid. And then evidently you can give her to your husband to screw. But that's for another video as well. So even when the man is paying the bride price, that sets up a positive view of women. When there's a dowry involved, it sets up a negative, and it's not clear that these things necessarily cancel each other out. This is why women are implicitly valued less than men in the Bible. But it's worse than that. Because the Bible explicitly values women as less. When I think it's in Numbers, and I apologize, the reference isn't in my notes, but the Bible specifically gives relative values in shekels for people, male and female, of different ages. And I'll just kind of read these off fairly quickly. From 1 month to 5 years, males are worth 5 shekels, and females are worth 3 shekels. Not quite, it's a little better than half, but it's still a difference. And the interesting thing is here is for census purposes, when you're counting up the number of people in the population, only males over 1 month of age are counted. Females aren't listed as being counted at all. This is Numbers 3:15, I think. From the ages of 5 to 20, males are worth 20 shekels and females are worth 10. Basically, this is like the lowest value, 50%, or lowest relative value. Obviously, little girls being worth only 3 shekels is, the lowest. But from 5 to 20 years, males are worth 20, females are worth 10. From 20 to 60 years, males are worth 50, because now you're in the working age. They can actually do some work. So now they're worth 50, and females are worth 30. Over 60, males are worth 15 shekels, and females are worth 10. Now, setting aside the issue of how the all-knowing, all-caring, all-wise, and intelligent superpower that governs the universe and decides to make these proclamations to people so that they're written down and passed down forever. Setting aside that power, how absolutely ridiculous is it that that sort of being would not only give explicit values in a specific currency for people, when we know that the value of currency changes. A dollar doesn't buy in 2018 what it bought in 1950. Not even close. For some products, I think it's almost 30 times or more the difference. And that's just a short pan. That's, not quite within my lifetime, but within less than a century. And so these rules have been around for a couple thousand years or more, several thousand years. We can't quite date the origin of the first books, but we can guesstimate. So the all-knowing creator of the universe just explicitly labeled people, labeled them as unequal, and gave dollar or shekel values for them, despite the fact that he should understand that currency values are going to change. And you can say, well, of course he knew that. This was for those people at those time, and it would change. Well, where's the update? Where's the updated list? And by the way, isn't that overlooking the fact that the God is essentially saying, hey, men are worth way more than women? This is about as explicit as the Bible could get and does get about the relative values. And for my money, and I don't have that many shekels, but it's also an absolute refutation of any claim that the Bible views men and women as equal. There are others, and we'll talk about some of them when we get to the New Testament. Women are to have authority over men and not to speak in church and all these other things when it comes to rights. And so these sorts of ideas made it really easy to say that, hey, women shouldn't be allowed to have property. Women shouldn't be allowed to vote. And, the man is the head of the household as Christ is the head of the church. Now, getting back to dowry for just a second, it's true that a dowry can serve as a protection for women in some circumstances because it has, if the woman is mistreated, and as a result of this, there's a divorce, a separation, whatever dowry she came with is typically returned to that family. It's kind of like an insurance policy that you're going to take care of our daughter or we're going to get our stuff back. But given the inferior protections and status that women generally have in the Bible and in civilizations that use the Bible as their foundation, it works as a strong net negative against having daughter. There's no guarantee. Hey, I married your daughter, I moved off. You're never going to find out if I mistreated her or not. You're not getting that dowry back. And unless there's a demonstration that she's been mistreated and has to be freed, she has no property rights over that dowry. Now, there is some confusion here because if the dowry is a handmaid that works for her, then she can give it to her husband, and that's a little different. But if she comes with 40 acres and a mule, that essentially goes to the husband and the husband's family. Again, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that the Bible explicitly endorses dowry in that concept, despite using the word in the English translations. But the civilizations that made use of the Bible definitely did this, and there's no admonition against it, and it seems consistent with what the Bible has to say about women's relative status. It's also been argued that the dowry is a substitute for inheritance. Essentially, daughters cannot inherit because they'll have a dowry, or perhaps they have a dowry because they can't inherit. Either way, as long as she's taken care of, the dowry isn't actually hers, it's viewed as that family's. But what does that say when you can have multiple wives and concubines without it being considered infidelity, if infidelity is the only grounds for a divorce, if there are in fact grounds for divorce, which is another point of confusion. When it comes to actual property, Numbers 27:8 allows daughters to inherit only if there are no sons. So essentially, you have property, and if you have sons, they will inherit. And if there are no sons, then the daughter inherits. If there's no children at all, it then goes to your brethren, your father's brethren, your kinsmen. At no point does it go to your wife, it always goes to your father's brethren, not your mother's brethren. It's difficult to say, oh, the Bible says women cannot own property. That's clearly not true, because if you're the daughter and you have no brothers, you can inherit. That's at least covered in Numbers. But I wonder if we're being a bit anachronistic about this. If apologists are saying, oh, well, look, this is our current understanding based on everything, and not actually looking at what the Bible has to say. Because when I mentioned women having daughters being viewed as a net negative because of dowry, that's not the only thing that makes women viewed as a net negative. When a woman gives birth to a male child, she's unclean for 7 days. Now, I'd love, maybe in another video when we talk about the Bible and sex and birth and families and stuff, we'll get into how gross it is to just label women as unclean for 7 days. But when she gives birth to a girl, she's unclean for 14 days. Essentially, it is twice as sinful to give birth. It's sinful to give birth to a boy, but it's twice as sinful to give birth to a girl. And I say sinful to expressly point out that there is an apparent contradiction here, where the Bible says, go forth, be fruitful and multiply. And it tends to say a lot of positive things about children. It also views the pain of childbirth as a result of Eve's sin and the uncleanliness, which, yes, it has to do with the tabernacle and holiness as well, but it's twice as much for girls. But it's not just that gives us the impression that there's something wrong with girls. Having a girl is worse. Being a woman who is capable of having children is already a problem. But women are also unclean during their menstruation. It's not just the woman that's unclean. It's anything that she touches or sits on or lies on that's unclean. And it's so unclean that anybody who touches her or touches the thing she sat on or lay on becomes unclean as well. And so this period here of 7 days, and heaven forbid that you actually have sex with a woman who's menstruating. The Bible seems to have kind of a couple different views about this. You see, in Leviticus 15, If you touch anything that a woman, you touch the menstruating woman or anything she's touched or lay on in that period of being unclean, you have to go and wash, and you will not be clean until evening. If you have sex with her in Leviticus 15, you are unclean for a week. And after the week is up, what the woman has to do is go and kill 2 turtles or 2 pigeons. So we're back to, let's offer up sacrifices, and specifically in this case, turtles or pigeons. I wonder perhaps if maybe, since we didn't have a market to sell tampons and pads back then, if there was instead a market of selling turtles. Hey, come on over, get your turtles. Have you been bleeding for a week? Are you done now? Are you ready to be clean? Get your turtles, get your pigeons, sacrifice them up to Yahweh. He loves it. So there's got to be the sacrifice demonstrating that there's some sort of purification / sin offering. And God really loves, blood, apart from menstrual blood, which he supposedly created, but he loves the other blood. But that's Leviticus 15. If we take a look at Leviticus 20, I think around verse 18 or so, if you have sex with a menstruating woman, and it goes into greater detail, because it talks about if you have sex with a menstruating woman and uncover the fountain, or uncover her and discover her fountain, then you have to be cut off from your people. Wow. So in Leviticus 15, if you have sex with a menstruating woman, you are unclean for a week. In 5 chapters later, if you have sex with a menstruating woman, you're cut off from your people. Well, there is that additional passage. So maybe you're not being cut off from your people for having sex with a woman, but maybe you're cut off because you dared to look down at her nether regions, to her fountain. You uncovered her and looked, and that makes it worse. So the Bible's not particularly progressive on sex, certainly not sex positive. But the laws in the Bible with respect to divorce, adultery, polygamy, incest, rape, etc., all seem to be very, very male-centric. There are passages that talk about if a man suspects his spouse of cheating on him, here's what you do. Where are the passages that say if a woman suspects her spouse of cheating on her, here's what she can do? It's entirely possible that somebody will email me and say, you've overlooked this verse. Cool. But unless that verse is offering equal status and equal rights, I don't know that it fundamentally changes what the objection is, because there could be many verses that I missed during this study, because essentially we haven't even gotten out of the first 5 books of the Bible talking about problems with women. And even within those, there are specific stories that we're hoping to address. Women's values and worth and rights are virtually non-existent. Okay, so she's worth 10 shekels. Oh, 5 shekels, or 3 shekels, or 15 shekels, or 10 shekels. What? How is this sort of determination made? Oh, she can have property, but only if she doesn't have brothers, because there's a male primacy. When Lot has angelic visitors and the crowd is banging at the door, wanting to have sex with them, he instead offers up his daughters. Now, the very fact that he can offer up his daughters demonstrates that they are his to offer up and do with as he pleases. The fact that he would offer up his daughters demonstrates how little he values even his own daughters. But angels have to be more valuable than, daughters. Really? Wouldn't you think that angels might have the power to, smite the crowd, stand up for themselves, protect themselves? Oh, well, it wasn't a real offering, it wasn't something done seriously. It's done to show his devotion. Yeah, we'll talk more about that when we get to Lot, but you've also got Jephthah, who makes a deal with God to win a battle and says, hey, I'll sacrifice the first thing that comes out of my door to greet me when I get home. Well, it's his daughter. But what did he think it should be? And it doesn't say that he didn't offer her up. Yes, apologists will say, oh, well, maybe it wasn't to be an offering to God, as in killing her. Maybe he just gave her to the temple. Doesn't matter. Where was the consideration of her rights, of her value, of her autonomy, of her ability to choose her own destiny? But all those are specifics for future videos. There's one last note that I want to make for this video before we move on to the rest of the problems that the Bible has with women. Oh, and by the way, we will be talking about the Quran and women as well at some point in this series. So this video barely scratches the surface. As I said, we've barely gotten out of the first 5 books, despite a quick meandering off to the New Testament. There are specific stories to address that demonstrate how women are viewed. But here's the reason I'm doing this and why it's important. Despite the fact that we've barely scratched the surface, there's already mountains of problems in just the verses that I've talked about. Just the general view of women as second-class citizens, as perhaps being roughly the equivalent of livestock or property. But what bugs me is that despite the progress we've made in the many generations since our backward ancestors first penned these abominations, despite even what most modern Christians think and say about women and women's rights, despite what modern Jews often have to say about women and women's rights, this idea that women are worthless or worthless has infused itself into our society so much that we have women who become convinced of this or are indoctrinated to believe that they are second-class citizens, that the man is the head of the household, that they should keep quiet and stay back, that they don't have a right to their own bodily autonomy, sexual autonomy, that they don't have the right to take charge of their life and end a marriage if it's the right thing. Women have become so convinced of this that they are teaching their daughters who teach their daughters who teach their daughters. It is a cycle that is directly in opposition to the sound foundations of humanism. It is obscene. And when we have conversations with people and they, let's take a look at the teleological argument for the existence of God. Let's take a look at ontological arguments. Let's take a look at the cosmological arguments. I care about those things. I care about whether or not we have good reason to think that a God exists. I don't think that that's the case. But if in fact there were a God, and the Bible represents his thoughts on people and their value, then that God is an immoral thug and not particularly bright, because he wrote it all down, or he encouraged people to write it down. And then it gets passed around, and what you end up with is a bunch of polluted minds acting as sycophants to marginalize women. It's not the only thing that the Bible gets wrong. But in the modern world, the fact that there are women who think that they need to be subservient, that they need to, from God on high, they should set aside their autonomy and worth and become second tier to a man or to their group and their church. It's almost unthinkable. And while none of this is an argument against the existence of God, perhaps there is a God and he's just immoral, what it does do is provide ammunition to people who think that the Bible should ever rightly be called the good book. This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.